Genealogy has meant so much to me over the past 28 years of my life. It's helped me understand myself and my family's circumstances better. It's given me a sense of historical and cultural identity. It's helped me feel connected to other people and other times in a meaningful way. It's helped me situate myself in a larger narrative and know my modest and proper place as the product of many different lives. It's given me a sense of pride and hope, too, as I've learned about the struggles and sacrifices of some of my ancestors. Then, too, I've learned to accept their mistakes, sins, and flaws in a clear-eyed way. Genealogy teaches you about human limitations and our common failings as often as it raises your spirits and lifts your hopes about human potential. Because genealogy has meant so much to me, it really concerns me that African Americans, in spite of expressing so much interest in the subject recently, have had such a difficult time unearthing their own stories. We can attribute the problem to many causes: the nature of slavery itself, neglect, and yes, often active prejudice from the genealogical community, historical efforts to hide or sugarcoat the truth about the Old South, ancestral poverty, which leads to fewer records, and sometimes even a family's own reluctance to talk about past hardships and injustices. All of these can erect roadblocks, particularly in the period before 1865, when slavery ended for most black people in the United States. To me, the situation feels like both a consequence of and another contributing factor toward inequality in our society. When folks are deprived of their personal history, I perceive it as just another way to disempower them and hold them back. Maybe this isn't always done consciously today. On the other hand, it might be done consciously, but it was certainly the intention of the slaveholders themselves. Knowledge of your ancestors and their dignity as people has a definite impact on your feelings about yourself. A man cannot really be a slave until he is made to accept that status, and this is exactly what those who broke slaves attempted to do: strip them of their identity, take away any connection to their origins, devalue their personhood, and put them entirely at the master's mercy. The way I see it, finding out what happened in the past and who your family was, in spite of the challenges, is almost like fighting back, reclaiming identity generation by precious generation. Slavery itself, of course, attached an enslaved person's identity to that of his or her master. The master was the legal person, and the slave was considered property or chattel, the word that is literally used to describe enslaved people in public records. Chattel means any property that you can move from one place to another at will, unlike, say, land or buildings or mineral rights. One of the clearest manifestations of this problem are the pre-1870 census records, which list slaves anonymously under the names of their masters by age and gender. The master's name was the only name that counted to the government in these lists. So the only way that you can trace a slave is by knowing the master's family inside out, and by tracing every detail concerning them, including their migrations, their legal transactions, marriages, and inheritance patterns. Now that process can seem unjust in and of itself. It just feels wrong to be forced to confront the people who exploited your ancestors at every step when you're doing the research. But there's no alternative due to the legal identity issue. You simply must take that route if you want to make headway. Then, because enslaved people are movable, not only do they accompany white owners in their movements, they're split up as inheritance. They're sold within the neighborhood. They're leased to other planters or even the government or industrial concerns for periods of time. They can be sold to slave traders who will take them to the South or West and usher them into even harsher slave economies. And because in most cases, only the given names of slaves are known. Some did use surnames within the plantation economy, but they were not recorded that way in the records. It's easy to lose track of them as they move and confuse them with other people who have the same name. Another complication associated with movement is the fact that society did not respect the slave family in any formal legal sense. Of course, the conditions varied from plantation to plantation and from slaveholder to slaveholder. Some holders at least professed an interest in keeping families together, in particular if the enslaved were well behaved, had special skills or relationships to the master. But in a pinch, we can expect even the most conscientious, so to speak, enslaver to look to his own interests first. This is why there's no property holding among enslaved people, except at the master's sufferance. There's no legal marriage. There are no parental rights. The master has to keep those slaves movable. He can split families. He can choose partners for enslaved people. He can permit white overseers, workmen, relatives, and neighbors to take sexual advantage of slave women or do so himself. Slave owners did often use their implied power to split families to keep slaves compliant. The slave master's business and personal interests always had priority before the law. Few public records, therefore, will mention slaves in relation to their kinship ties because the law did not recognize those relationships. These conditions make it so difficult to piece together families. In fact, apart from inventories or lists of enslaved people or legal transfers that group young children with their mothers or partners and families with one another, or private records of slave births kept by the masters, much of what we know about enslaved people's relationships must come from public records written after the end of slavery, when freed people first received legal recognition as independent individuals. These documents often speak backward in time as to how enslaved people were related to one another. So the records, mostly the marriage and death records, that come up immediately after freedom are the most important in shining a light into this very dark cavern of enslavement. Another issue in tracing slave families is the sometimes frequent transfer in ownership. An enslaved person might have several slaveholders across his or her lifetime and live in several places, sometimes far removed from one another. The law did not require enslavers to record the bills of sale that they used to transfer ownership, and so only a small proportion of these are actually available in public records. There was almost always a document when a slave changed hands, but it was usually kept by the new owner among private papers, which survived only sporadically. It may never have been entered into public registers. If so, it becomes difficult to nearly impossible to locate such records. That's why at some point the trail is likely to grow cold. The more shifts in ownership there were, the more likely the thread of relationship you find may vanish. So often the trail will go cold. These factors, along with the lack of landed property among freed people at the end of slavery and for generations afterwards, and that's important considering that most public records have something to do with property ownership. All that can pose real challenges, especially to someone just starting out. You have to think also about how the freed person claimed his new surname. As I said, most folks didn't actually get their surname recorded in public records during slavery, but adopted one afterwards or used the one that they had used informally in slavery when they became free men. If they got this name from the last enslaver, you have a ready-made pointer for your research pathway. But if the freed person drew that name from another source, it becomes much more difficult to determine who held them and thus continue your search. Because of the difficulty of this entire endeavor, my advice is to research your family in freedom very carefully first, teaching yourself the basics of genealogy in the process before you decide to venture into the period of enslavement. Look in every possible corner for evidence of your family from 1865 forward, and don't just restrict yourself to the direct line. Look at siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins. Their documents will give you more information about your direct common ancestors in the period of enslavement. Contact living people descended from the folks you're studying. It may be they received different information than you have through their family traditions. They may have artifacts, photos, and documents kept in the family that will help you on your journey. You really need to build up your skill set and the information you have before you tackle this slavery thicket. I know it may sound like it, but I'm really not trying to depress you about this process. I intend to show you examples of what you can do to press your lineage back into slavery times, and not just to document relationships, but to uncover what can be known about the conditions under which your enslaved ancestors lived, what kinds of work they did, what their experiences were, and how that influenced their lives after slavery. You can get there. We take as our example today the story of Willis Hinton, a man who rose from slavery to become a leader of Highpoint's African American community in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now here's what we know about Willis when we started, mostly from reminiscences in our files here at the Highpoint Public Library, from census records and old newspaper articles which mention him. Willis Hinton came to Highpoint with his brother, Albert Miller, very soon after the end of slavery to work on the railways. He was said to have laid track between here and Jamestown. This photo purports to show Willis and Albert together with Willis's children. The 1870 census shows us that they were indeed here at that time, and that both were railway workers. Highpoint, in fact, was the gift of the North Carolina Railroad, where it crossed the old plank road which led from Salem to Fayetteville. Without the conjunction of the rail line with the main road, there would have been no city here. The city was founded between 1852 and 1859 when it received its charter from the state legislature. So it wasn't very old when Willis and his brother first came. Now first, you have to know that the antebellum North Carolina railways were all built with slave labor, at least in part. So when slaves were freed, many of them were already skilled in helping to lay out track and maintain roads, rails and roadbeds. It was a natural thing for them to seek work in this business after freedom. Coming to Highpoint might have made sense also to a freed person because the enslaved population in this area was lower than in many other places in North Carolina. There were a lot of Republicans and Unionists here, people who had opposed the Civil War, and some of whom had opposed slavery as well, especially among the Friends and Wesleyan Methodists. The city of Highpoint, for example, and surrounding areas voted a majority for Ulysses S. Grant in 1868, if that tells you anything. That's not to say that this patch of earth was so enlightened in other respects, certainly in racial equality respects, but it was different than the eastern and southern parts of North Carolina Piedmont. The area on the Virginia line from Caswell through Person and Granville to Northampton and Halifax County was a big tobacco belt. And it was certainly different from the coastal areas where large plantations and rich earth meant cash crops and heavy concentrations of slavery. Both Albert and Willis began their families here. Willis married Fanny Sullivan in 1869, and they actually lived next to a rather well-to-do white man, a merchant named Albert V Sullivan, in the town of Highpoint, according to the 1870 census, which you see here. If you go back to the 1860 census, Albert Sullivan was the depot agent here in Highpoint. He'd been married to his wife, Louisa Bell, in 1849. In Fanny Hinton's obituary, it is stated that she was known as a mammy, which makes me wonder whether she had been enslaved by the Sullivan family to serve as a nurse for their children. Or maybe she went to work for them after being freed. The Sullivans don't seem to have had any surviving children. In any case, She was probably working for them when Willis met her. Of course, Willis started out laboring on the railroad, and later it said he worked in the depot. No wonder he met and married the depot master's servant. Supposedly Fanny was born in Forsyth County, according to her death certificate, and this is where Albert Sullivan came from, in fact. In the 1860 census slave schedule of Highpoint shows that Albert Sullivan owned a single enslaved person that year, a girl aged 10 years. Could that be Fanny? In 1850, he lived in Forsyth and owned 3 enslaved people, a mulatto male aged 13, a black woman aged 20, and an infant female only a few months old. That little child might well be Fanny as well. The question which comes to mind immediately is, what happened to the 20-year-old woman, who was almost certainly her mother, and the 13-year-old boy between 1850 and 1860? Did the mother die? Was she sold? If it was the latter, why did Albert keep Fanny? In either case, Fanny was certainly a woman who had experienced significant loss early in her life. Interestingly, in 1875, Albert Sullivan, likely her former owner, went out between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning to a pond outside of Highpoint with a dose of laudanum and a gun. He took the laudanum, but when it didn't kill him, he walked into the water and shot himself in the head. The newspaper article which reported this event alleged that Albert was distraught because of financial losses and fear that he would not be able to support his wife. Deeds show that Albert Sullivan lived on the north side of Washington Street, way back in the 1850s and 60s. And that just goes to show that Washington Street, which was called Jamestown Road further out, is just precisely that old. Fanny and Willis would continue to make it their home. And here is an actual image of the newspaper article which tells us about the details of Albert Sullivan's suicide. Together, Willis and Fanny had some 15 children, but only 9 survived until 1900. We know that from the 1900 census pictured here. In those days, Highpoint was always bragging about its healthful location. People came here to bathe in mineral springs, and the city was always touting its clean air, refreshing breezes, clean water, and low death rates, especially because there were several schools that attracted students from around the state. There was a desire to reassure parents because child mortality was very high in the 1800s. But Fanny and Willis lost 6 children out of the 15 that she gave birth to. So I'll let that speak for itself about Highpoint's claims to salubrity. Albert Miller, Willis's brother, joined himself to Laura Young in wedlock, but their life together began at the very end of slavery. So they got a cohabitation certificate from Guilford County in 1866 to make sure that their children would be legitimate before the law and that their family ties would be protected. However, they only dated their relationship from 1865, so it's likely that they met in Highpoint as well. It's said that Albert operated a brickyard here in the late 1870s. He was certainly a person of some consequence in the black community. We can see from a newspaper article that he joined the Grant Club in 1872 and represented Guilford County in a district convention of freedmen. Undoubtedly, the Grant Club mobilized African Americans who could only begin to vote at this time to support the re-election of President U.S. Grant in the 1872 election. Only a few more years remained before federal troops would be withdrawn from the South, and black folk would face the slow and steady erosion of their rights as citizens. Perhaps Albert and his wife sensed these changes were coming. By 1880, they had moved to Manhattan in New York, where he worked as a janitor initially. At FamilySearch.org, we can just use New York City marriage and death certificates indexes and the censuses to trace Albert's subsequent course. He died, it would seem, in 1887. In the record of that death, he is identified as a Negro minister living on West 41st Street in Manhattan. He was buried in Elizabeth, New Jersey, however. His wife and daughter remained in Manhattan for a time, but the widow Laura remarried to a man named Peter Hill in 1894, who had been born in Dinwiddie County, Virginia. The two identified themselves as white, astonishingly. We know it's Laura, however, because she gives her birthplace specifically as Highpoint, North Carolina. Could it be that she, or both she and her husband, were passing as white during that time? She was identified as a mulatto in the 1880 and 1910 censuses. But in any case, Peter Hill died soon afterwards. The daughter Mary also married twice, and the entire family moved to Asbury Park, Monmouth County, New Jersey, where Laura worked in a boarding house and later lived with her son-in-law. She died in 1921, leaving a will. In addition to their own daughter, Mary, Albert and Laura Miller raised Albert's nephew, Jefferson Miller. In the 1880 census, we find him identified as such, but he was already living with them in Highpoint in 1870. He accompanied them to Manhattan, where he married and raised a large family, dying in 1930. Jefferson's death certificate erroneously identifies Albert Miller as his father and Laura as his mother, probably because these were the only parents that he ever spoke about. It would take more digging to find out just how he was related to Albert and Willis. Willis Hinton remained in Highpoint. He was obviously a hard worker and a good steward of his resources. When he could no longer work for the railroad, he got a job in Captain Snow's bobbin and shuttle factory. This enterprise manufactured parts of loom machinery needed to weave cloth in the Piedmont's numerous textile mills. The production of wooden components was a booming business here in the late 19th century, until furniture began to take off in the 1890s. Later, Willis worked at the sash and blind factory of E.A. Snow, Captain Snow's son. It was said that he also sold fish from a vendor cart door to door to supplement his income, and doubtless Fanny did her part too. With what they could save, they began to accumulate small but strategic tracts of property on Jamestown Road and Washington Street. The first piece was acquired in 1880, but he continued to operate the brickyard, which he mentioned in his 1922 will. The late 19th century saw tremendous need for building materials as the city grew, and there were also frequent fires before the foundation of a fire department, and that required rebuilding and repair, of course. Willis became a prominent figure at Mount Vernon Baptist Church and gained the trust and respect of many local citizens, both black and white. Apparently, he was known for coming up to strangers from behind, tapping them with his cane and asking whether they knew Jesus. He was called Uncle Willis broadly around the town, which sounds demeaning, but was considered a term of respect among white people in those days. On the 10th of March, 1887, something tremendous happened in his life that changed it forever. Willis was trying to put a belt back on a wheel of machinery at the sash and blind factory while it was still in motion. He was caught by the belt and carried to the shaft, which spun frantically near the ceiling of the factory floor. He kept turning there, suspended in midair, his heels kicking against the ceiling boards above until several were knocked out. There were no safety shutoffs in those days. Every bit of his clothing was torn from his body during this dramatic and frightening event. He was hurt, but not killed. This event marked a huge change in his life. He could no longer carry the heavy burdens he had before. He had to find a different way to earn a living. The situation would have broken many men, but Willis had real estate now and some savings. He opened a restaurant on South Main near the depot where African American travelers could pause for refreshment. The 1890s saw the expansion of Jim Crow laws in the South, mandating separation between the races in all public accommodation. Black men largely lost their voting rights. There was much violence and repression. Lynching became commonplace. There were no longer any black public officials. Willis, it would seem, took advantage of the separation of the races to open a business. And you might say that he made the best of a bad situation, as did many others with some means at that time. Later, he abandoned the restaurant and, leveraging some of his property holdings, gathered up enough money to open Hinton House, an 11-room hotel for African Americans, which he opened in 1899 or 1900. He continued to operate it successfully for many years. When he died in 1922, he was able to leave provision for each of his children in his will, which you see here. He was particularly interested in seeing that his son Charlie would be able to construct his own new house and would have a place to live until he could. Sometimes the newspaper articles from the period seemed to make fun of Uncle Willis. You can see an example here. I sense a little discomfort that a black man made good under trying circumstances. His achievements defied the racial theories of the time. But then the newspapers are simply full of racist venom at this point in history, much worse than anything implied here. We have to acknowledge just how amazing Willis Hinton's achievements were. He must have had enormous discipline and determination to rise above all obstacles and make provision for his family, leaving them a lasting legacy. As far as we know, he wasn't even able to write his name. Every deed that he and Fanny signed, even his last will, is signed by Mark. So where did this remarkable man originate? That was the key question that started us on this journey in the first place. As we explore that process, we'll see many different kinds of records that can open up the lives of enslaved ancestors because, indeed, Willis, like Fanny, was born an enslaved person. One of the first things that I attempted to do in tracing Mr. Hinton was to look for his marriage record to Fanny Sullivan and for his death certificate. I could estimate that his marriage took place shortly before 1870 because there were no children living with him and Fanny according to that census record. They must have been married within the past few years. Freedmen's marriages would have been recorded from 1865 forward, and cohabitation records from the earliest period from, say, 1866 to 67. I knew precisely when he died from his gravestone, but I missed the death certificate, and I also missed his marriage record initially. They were there, but I failed to find them because I was using the databases on Ancestry.com. The problem was that his name was misread and garbled by the person indexing the records for Ancestry, and the strategies I was using in my search were inadequate to overcome those flaws in the index. If I'd just gone straight to the microfilm of the marriage register or searched by the date of death and the county rather than his name for the death certificate, I would have found them both. That would have made things a lot easier, but both documents give the names of Willis's parents. But since I didn't have them at the outset, I'll hold that information in reserve for now. What I did find was Miss Ida's death certificate, which you see here on the left. This was their older, unmarried daughter. Her informant, the person who gave the information for her death certificate, gave her father's place of origin as Raleigh. So that convinced me that I needed to look in Wake County to find where Willis Hinton might have been enslaved. First of all, I made an assumption that Willis had retained his slave owner's surname. Now, that might or might not have been true, but it was a good gamble to make at first. Keep in mind, though, that sometimes when enslaved people pull up roots after freedom and move elsewhere, they don't always keep that last owner's name, and sometimes they may even change their surnames in the early years of freedom. They are more likely to keep the master's surname when they stay in the same place where they had lived under slavery. But it may not be the most recent slave master. It may be one more remote, on their mother's side, on their father's side. The thing is, I had two surnames, not just Hinton, but Miller. Willis Hinton's brother was Alfred Miller. And not only that, I found also that the nephew who lived with Alfred Miller, Jeff Miller, when he moved to Manhattan and married, identified his father as Henry Caldwell and his mother as Martha Ann Miller. Another nephew, Charles H. Hinton, also moved to New York, owned his own barbershop in Manhattan, and was listed as an actor in the 1910 census. When he died, his death certificate listed his father as Henry with no surname and his mother as Martha Miller. So apparently we have 3 siblings or even half-siblings, Willis Hinton, Albert Miller, and Martha Ann Miller. Some descendants used the Hinton name and some used the Miller name. Why did that happen? One passage in a short biography of Willis Hinton states that he and his brother Albert had different surnames because they belonged to 2 different people. My first thought was that there might have been a marriage between a white Hinton and a white Miller. Willis's father and mother began to live together when they belonged to one family, but by inheritance or purchase, the family was split up in some way, with Albert going to one owner and Willis going to another. But it could also have been the case that a Hinton slave-owning family lived near a Miller slave-holding family. The husband lived on one plantation and visited his wife on the other. The wife and the children would have kept her owner's surname, and the husband might have retained his owner's surname. Maybe some of the children after freedom took their father's surname, while others adopted that of their mother. Family life could be extremely precarious when one black family was owned by 2 unrelated masters. But such cross-plantation relationships were quite common. Slave owners frequently allowed men on their farms to spend time with their wives overnight and on Sundays. But I went for the marriage between a Miller and a Hinton first. It turned out to be correct. I found only one antebellum marriage recorded in Wake County between a Hinton and a Miller. It was between Lawrence Hinton, sometimes called Lawrence, and Jane Constance Miller in 1851. Later I discovered this little newspaper clipping from the Enterprise using newspapers.com. It shows Willis Hinton preparing to go back to Raleigh to participate in a colored fair in 1914. The article names the owner of the plantation where Willis had served as Lawrence Hinton and says he was always well received by the children and grandchildren of this man. Finding this kind of a confirmation is pretty rare. What you usually do when you think you know who the master was is to compare the age of the enslaved person and his race and gender with the slave schedules in 1850 and 1860, and also look to see if lists of slave property exist for that white family in, say, estate papers or wills or private records kept by the family itself. If you find names you recognize in these lists, you're probably on the right track. Lawrence and Jane Miller Hinton resided on a plantation called Broomfield, which lay about 4 miles south of Raleigh on the Ramsgate Road. It was one of many Hinton plantations in the vicinity of Raleigh. The Hintons were one of the leading and founding families of Wake County. They were county officials and legislators, as you can see from the chart. Their lands extended to many thousands of acres altogether and lay mostly to the south and west of Raleigh. By the 1830s, many of them had dozens of enslaved people. In fact, in the 1860 slave schedule of Lawrence Hinton, he claimed ownership of 33 different men, women, and children housed in 5 slave cabins. The Hintons owned several town lots in the city of Raleigh as well. In fact, Raleigh was founded as a state capital on land which had belonged to them. And they also liked to keep it in the family. As the chart demonstrates, they tended to marry their own cousins. Lawrence Hinton's father and mother were second cousins. Jane Constance Miller Hinton's mother was a Hinton herself, the daughter of David Hinton of the Oaks Plantation, and a cousin to her husband Lawrence. The Millers came from Goochland County, Virginia, by way of Granville County, North Carolina. Henry Massey Miller, who was Jane Constance's father, then moved to Raleigh, where he died rather young. Mapping out the white family is very important. It was pretty easy to do by using wills and estate records and census records. I recommend it as a first step because studying how enslaved people passed through inheritance, gift, or through marriage is a major part of tracking enslaved families over time. There were also numerous Hinton family Bibles, which are in the state archives in Raleigh, and these have been digitized so that you can look at them online. They help me a lot with the names and the dates. Were no names of enslaved people in these Bible records, but sometimes you will find special pages that record slave names in the white owner's Bible. They may even have kept such records in separate business-related books. Well, I was extremely fortunate, actually, to find that Lawrence and Constance Jane Miller Hinton did leave family papers that were preserved in a public archive, in this case at the Southern Historical Collection at UNC Chapel Hill. I even found some pictures that had been deposited in the State Archives in Raleigh, which I discovered by searching the archives catalog. Here in the middle, you see a photo of Jane Constance Miller herself, later in life, Willis's last slave mistress. To the left is a picture of Lawrence Hinton's sister Adelaide Hinton Sewell. To the right, there's a picture of Dr. William R. Miller, who was a Confederate surgeon and brother of Jane Constance Miller Hinton. He advised Mrs. Hinton after her husband died late in the Civil War and took her in when the family was displaced by Sherman. He oversaw repairs on Broomfield after the war. Now here, on the left, is a picture of Broomfield Plantation itself, taken many years later. The house was severely damaged at the end of the Civil War, and so this is probably not exactly what it looked like when Willis was there. It's declined a bit. To the right, I've compiled information about Lawrence Hinton's plantation taken from the 1860 agricultural census of Wake County. Did you know between 1850 and 1880 there's a special schedule describing every farm in every county in the state? When you see that this plantation was focused on cotton production, it explains why enslaved people were so important to its economy and success. There was also a pretty large interest in livestock here. You can find information like this for practically any plantation or farm in the South between 1850 and 1880. And they are on Ancestry.com and easy to access by the name of the owner or occupant of the farm. Sometimes even people who don't own the land are listed. They're just leasing it. A point must be made here. Public records can help a lot when you're studying enslaved ancestors, but there's nothing better than the private papers of the people who kept them in bondage. In this case, the collection contained hundreds of documents. They included many personal letters, bills of sale, accounts and receipts, business correspondence and agreements, even a long reminiscence. And they had even been digitized, actually, by UNC, so I didn't have to travel to look at them, although I did end up going because I didn't know that when I started out. How do you find the papers of a slaveholder? Well, first, most slave-owning families didn't keep these records. Like anything else, over the generations, descendants tend to throw out old papers, maybe especially, as you might imagine, when the subject is slavery. But more survive than you may think, especially when we're talking about large-scale plantations like Broomfield. Many collections are in public and university archives. Some papers may be in a local library or museum. Use Archive Grid and the National Union Catalog of Manuscript Collections to search for these papers online. Check universities associated with the descendants of a white family. They often deposited their old papers with their alma mater. Now, not all archive collections are described or included in these catalogs, so just contacting archives you suspect or checking the websites of individual special collections can be a useful strategy. If you're really brave, you could track down the slave-owning family's descendants and write letters or call asking if they have papers or information. Now, I know that that is very tricky, but You could find someone who is more helpful and sympathetic than you imagine. You might even approach them through a third party. Some of this material is still privately held, and that may be the only way to get at it. So I patiently plied through the Lawrence Hinton papers. I read everything I thought was relevant. I took down the names of every enslaved person mentioned and the circumstances and made a note of where I got that detail. I compiled an Excel spreadsheet of these mentions indexed by the names, and I have to say, a lot of people were mentioned, but there was no Albert and there was no Willis. However, I did get an intimate glimpse of the people who owned Willis just before the Civil War in their own words. The most interesting was probably the memoir of the mistress herself, Jane Constance Miller Hinton, that was written in the 1890s when she was quite old. She called it The Reminiscences of the Key Basket of a Southern Matron. It was composed in a very odd style from the point of view of the lady's key basket, which it was as if that object was alive and could speak. Here is what a key basket looks like on the right. It was usually made out of tooled leather and was used to hold the keys to all the doors in the plantation, the houses, the outbuildings, especially to those places where provisions and valuables were stored, like the larder, the pantry, hutches and display cabinets, smokehouses, wardrobes, pie safes. Key baskets were sometimes very ornamental. They were often given to a plantation mistress on the occasion of her marriage. What it reminded me of was the intense concern a slave mistress had to control access to food and valuables. Enslaved people were not usually given enough to eat. They were expected to work for the master during the day and tend their own little plots or gardens in off times. They might even be allowed to raise their own poultry. Old people and small children would help if they weren't fit for the field. What the master provided was often just a supplement, and so there were many lean and hungry times. The locked doors were there for a reason. But anyway, Jane Constance thought this a charming conceit to speak about her life through the voice of a key basket. Okay, the story mainly deals with her marriage, her happiness during the 1850s with her husband, and during the years of her children's infancy. But then she addresses the coming of the war, the increased hardship on the plantation, and the grief and challenges after her husband died in late 1864 at quite a young age. Suddenly there were no white men on the place. She had to scramble to find an overseer. Now most white men were at war. The man she found was the son of a doctor who worked at the state hospital for the mentally insane, which many of us remember as Dorothea Dix. It was located not very far away from her plantation. Then came the news that Sherman's troops were headed toward Raleigh, around the time of the last battle at Bentonville between Johnston and Sherman, and the truce signed at Bennett Place, all in that same neighborhood. She goes into great detail about the preparations that she made to refugee to her Raleigh home and to hide all the valuables, the livestock, and the provisions from the bummers. She happened to be at Broomfield when Sherman's troops arrived. They had hidden food and provisions in the walls and even in the steps of the porch to the house. But she grows angry as she talks about those enslaved folk who fled to Union lines and those who actually cooperated and revealed where the food stores were. Even the carpenter who helped conceal these caches in the structure of the house helped the Federal troops. I think this tells you something about the mindset of the typical slaveholder. Actually, the strategy of hiding the valuables in the walls and floors resulted in the house being torn to bits and may not have been the wisest course of action. She speaks fondly of those enslaved people who remained with her, cooperated in the ruse, and helped her and her family leave the house. What she didn't realize is that some of them were helping her not out of loyalty, but because they too would go hungry if the Union forces took all their foodstuffs. They were the ones who had worked so hard to gather the food and preserve it. Many of them she identifies by name, or they can be identified by comparison with other evidence. But again, no Willis and no Albert. Another set of letters has to do with Lawrence Hinton's youth in Alabama, long before his marriage to Jane Constance Miller. His father, Dr. Ransom Hinton, wrote several letters to him there trying to guide him in how to manage his resources as he sought to make his fortune. Ransom's brother-in-law, William Hinton, had resettled near Mobile. Lawrence spent some extended time there with his uncle, trying to find good investments for his property. Of course, the property he was talking about consisted of 6 enslaved people that his father had advanced him, aged between 12 and 21. In fact, this was all the slave inheritance that he ever received from his father, and those 6 people are never named, though they are referred to in Dr. Hinton's will. Lawrence took them with him to Alabama, and apparently his uncle may have ended up using them for his own enterprises. Ransom Hinton was trying to warn Lawrence not to trust his uncle, who was notoriously bad at business and on the edge of bankruptcy. He wanted to make sure that Lawrence got a contract with anyone to whom he leased his enslaved folk, not to mention staying away from Mobile, where there were so many Creole temptations, drink, and wild women, I assume. Dr. Hinton even wrote out a sample contract which provides the time frame for which the enslaved people are to be leased and when they should be returned, the basic standards of food, clothing, and working hours, etc. Now, leasing slaves was very common in both the Miller and the Hinton family. That's partly because of the early deaths of many of the parents and grandparents in both families. They left young children as heirs who needed someone to manage their property. And the income for these children was to rent the hardiest and most skilled slaves to others on other plantations, in railroad construction or domestic work. Some had special skills that made them valuable to lease to craftsmen in the city of Raleigh, but things sometimes went horribly wrong. There is correspondence between Lawrence Hinton and his brother-in-law, Reverend Willis L. Miller, who was Jane Constance's brother. Miller had permitted Lawrence to manage his enslaved people while he was at school, learning to be a minister at Union Theological Seminary in Virginia. When he heard that one of them, Jency, had been abused by the man to whom she was leased, he expressed regret and asked that her preferences should be taken into consideration when accepting a bid for her labor. He also asked if this abused woman Jency might be retained with the same contractor as another woman named Mary, who may have been a relative of hers. Of course, leasing the enslaved was a terrible business, no matter how concerned the owner was about their well-being or how many contracts were signed. The contractor's interest was in getting the most work out of the slave for the least amount of money. Whether that person was well-fed, well-housed, or healthy or not, that was not the priority. Abuse was very common. Imagine how harsh it might be for enslaved people leased to the railroads, the mines, or the mills. It irks me to hear a man of the cloth speaking so lightly of enslaved people on the one hand, while on the other he's trying to convince his brother-in-law, Lawrence, to accept the Christian religion. Of course, these men probably believed that the Bible commended slavery as natural and just. A lot of ink was spilled in defense of slavery against abolitionists in the North at this time, and some of the leading apologists for slavery were clergymen. They never stopped to think that in the ancient world, slavery was a given. No one questioned it at that time. In fact, the wealthy who wrote all the sources we have from the ancient world were too dependent on slavery for their comfort and leisure to question it. We very rarely, if ever, hear a slave's voice from those ancient times. Antebellum white Southerners rarely considered that they should apply the principles and spirit of Jesus' message to human relations rather than to laud the circumstances of the ancient world as a positive good. Ancient slavery was not race-based, of course, but it was no more positive good than Roman conquest or punitive taxes or crucifixion, about which Jesus also said very little. What was it like to live with Lawrence Hinton as your slaveholder? You can tell something from what the white people's papers indicate, of course, but it's always from their point of view. Court cases involving slaves might be a good way to tell. You might look for runaway notices in the newspapers where masters are advertising to get their so-called property back. Those identifying marks for the slaves tell you something about how they were treated. But I was truly lucky. I actually found 2 slave narratives spoken by former slaves of Lawrence Hinton. These were written down by members of the Writers' Project during the Depression for the Works Progress Administration. That was a group founded to give employment to writers who were out of work. One project that they had was to interview formerly enslaved folk in the 30s. These are all typed up and are available in online databases that you can search by slaves' names. And you can also listen to recordings sometimes. Look in your handout. Of course, it's only a sampling. The interviewers were mostly white people, so the comments of the ex-slaves are written usually in what was thought to be black dialect. Also, as you can imagine, interviewees didn't always feel comfortable sharing what they really thought with a white person interviewer. But with these 2 individuals, Robert Hinton and Penny Williams, we get 2 different views of the Lawrence Hinton plantation. I'm just going to let them speak for themselves, and I'm reading them as written, without the dialect mostly. I've substituted the word Negro for the N-word, but folks, the former slaves did use that word a lot. I suspect because that was a term that they heard all the time they were enslaved and much of the time afterward. So this is from Robert Hinton's first, the one on the left, remembering that he was part of a favored family mentioned in Jane Constance Hinton's memoir. We had common food in slavery time, but it was well fixed up and we were well clothed. We had a good place to sleep. Yes, sir, a good place to sleep. We worked from sunrise to sunset under overseers. They were good to us. I was small at that time. I picked up sticks in the yard and done some work around the house, but when they turned their backs, I would be playing most of the time. We played shooting marbles and running and jumping. We called the big house the dwelling house, and the slave quarter the slave houses. Some of them were in the master's yard, and some were outside. They give all the families patches and gardens, but they didn't sell anything. We had prayer meetings in our house when we got ready, but there were no churches for Negroes on the plantation. We had dances and other socials during Christmas time. They give us the Christmas holidays. No, sir, they did not whip me. I was mighty young. They didn't work children much. I've seen them whip the grown ones, though. I never saw a slave sold and never saw any in chains. They run away from their plantation, but they come back again. William Brickell, Sidney Cook, Willis Hinton, all run away. I don't know why they all run away, but some run away to keep from being whipped. The white folks, old missus, teach us the catechism, but they didn't want you to learn to read and write. I can read and write now, learned them since the surrender. Sometimes we went to the white folks' church. When we got sick, our boss man sent for a doctor. Dr. Burke Haywood, Dr. Johnson, or Dr. Hill. Yassa. That I seen the patrollers, but my old boss didn't allow them to whip his Negroes. Master give his men passes. I thought slavery was a bad thing because all slaves did not fare alike. It was all right for some, but bad for some, so it was a bad thing. Now that's the only reference to Willis Hinton that I found on the Lawrence Hinton plantation. Evidently, he ran away to avoid getting whipped, according to Robert Hinton. But then he came back. It makes sense. He was in his mid-20s when slavery ended. He was evidently welcomed back to visit the plantation after freedom well into the 20th century. Note that some of the former slaves did not take the Hinton surname. They had the names Brickell and Cook. Now on the right is Penny Williams speaking about the same plantation. We had enough to eat, such as it was, but that ain't bragging, I reckon. And we was punished bad if we complained, sass, or fuss to work like we would. Nat Whitaker was the overseer and patroller, and he was strict, I'm telling you. I've seen him beat slaves till the blood run. There was some Negro men that would go courting in spite of the devil, and as the master ain't giving no passes, they goes without 'em. Mr. Whitaker, he whips and whips, but that ain't stop 'em. At last, Master Lawrence decides to hang cowbells on their necks so he can hear 'em if they leave the place after night. I'm a-telling you, child, them Negroes are going anyway. They ain't got sense enough to put their hands on the bells to keep the clapper from ringing, but they do stuff the bell with leaves, and it don't ring none. Besides that, they tear their shirts or steal sheets from Mrs. Clothesline and fold 'em to make a scarf. They ties these round their necks to hide the bell and goes on according. They ain't got no pins to pin the scarf on, but they use thorns from the locust tree or the crab apple, and they hold fine. There weren't no spoons, knives, and forks them days, but the smart slave cut him some out of hickory, and they was just as good as any other kind. Now, this is a slightly different picture of slave life with Lawrence Hinton than Robert gave. Robert's views are based on the fact that his family was among the flavored slaves on Broomfield, and that made a considerable difference. Now, you shouldn't expect to find interviews for a lot of plantations. These particular ones were easy to find because they lived in Raleigh in the 1930s, but you should definitely try. And you can at least read narratives relevant to the county or region that you might be researching. They will give you some idea of what slavery was like in that area. When I finished going through the Lawrence Hinton papers, I continued looking at all the other ancestors on my chart. I focused on the probate records, the wills and estate files that were created when each of them died. Most died with enslaved people enumerated as property. The enslaved are frequently listed by name, but not always, sometimes with relationships between mothers and young children noted. Something had to be done with such property when the white folk died. Usually slaves were either sold at auction, or they were retained and put out to work to help support young heirs who were not old enough to manage their own estates yet. And then, when the heirs were old enough, they might be divided up in lots of roughly equal value among the heirs. I checked out guardianship papers and reports too. Now, some of those were in the estate file, and some were filed separately under guardians' records. Many were in books of recorded inventories, estate accounts, and sales. I had to check all of these. There might be something in one source that is missing in the others. One set of guardian records was in the private papers of Charles L. Hinton, who was guardian of Dr. Ransom Hinton's minor children, and also of Henry Massey Miller's children. Charles Hinton was a railroad promoter and also active in the office of the state treasurer of North Carolina during the sale of the lands belonging to the displaced Cherokee. Later, he himself became the state treasurer. Isabella Miller, the mother of Jane Constance Miller Hinton, was his sister. Now, these records relating to the settlement of estates can tell you a lot. They give you values, sometimes for slaves, in addition to their names. The values tell you something about their ages and skills, or if female, their potential to have children. You can get the names of purchasers of enslaved people, and so trace them to a new owner. The annual accounts show what income a guardian or administrator received each year from the estate and what his expenses were, sometimes down to a very minute level of detail. You might see where he sold an enslaved person under court order in a given year to make up for reduced income. You might see to whom he hired certain enslaved people that year, as in this example, and what income they realized. You can see several being hired to the railroad here. On the cost side, you might see when he paid for a doctor to attend one of the enslaved, or a midwife, which would indicate that a child was born to a particular enslaved woman about that time. There are accounts which show a leather apron being purchased for an enslaved man, probably because he had a special metalworking skill. There are others that show burial expenses being doled out when an enslaved person dies. This is probably the only indication that this death took place. All of these little bits of information, these little scraps, are very precious. They are really worth the search. Now finally, I checked all the deed books of Wake County back to the 18-teens for any bills of sale for slaves coming into the Miller and Hinton families and those sold out of it. That was a laborious process because although there are indexes to deed books for the grantee, that means the purchaser or the recipient, and for the grantor, the seller or the giver, The 20th century clerks who created them were not required to index any transactions that had to do with personal property, and most of the time they did not. Slaves were classed as personal property. Only transactions regarding land had to be included in the grantor-grantee index. That means if you want to find evidence of slaves changing hands, you have to look at each deed book individually. Thankfully, the clerk of Wake County Court created a handwritten index for each deed book as he finished them, either at the beginning or at the back of the book. I compared it against the typescript grantor-grantee index you see on the left, and any transactions in the written index that were not in the typed grantor-grantee must have involved something not related to land, and many of them did involve enslaved people. Here's one of particular interest. It shows a mother and child being sold by Charles L. Hinton as a guardian. Not only are the slaves named along with their new owner, but their precise birth dates are given. That means at one time there must have been a detailed accounting of all the slaves in this family by name and date of birth. Now that has yet to be found. Why did Charles Hinton include the birth dates in this bill of sale? Because in this document, he's guaranteeing that the enslaved people he is selling are exactly the age he says they are. Their value is partially related to their age. That's why he's stipulating the precise date. This level of detail isn't the usual thing. It actually surprised me to see it. Not all these deed book records are bills of sale. Some of them record mortgages of slaves. Yes, you could use your enslaved people as collateral to borrow money. Some are sales of slaves carried out by the sheriff because the master couldn't pay his debts. The slave was seized and sold to cover his master's obligations. Sometimes you get deeds of gift in which one person gives another a slave, usually because they're relatives. This often happens when a child in the white family was born, came of age, or got married, as in Dr. Hinton's gift of sale, a gift of his 6 slaves to his son Lawrence before he went to Alabama. That record was not recorded in North Carolina. It might have been recorded in Alabama where he transported them. The enormity of giving a person as a gift is beyond words, but it is the very nature of the institution. Now, I've warned you that the majority of slave transactions were never recorded in the deed books. People just hung on to the original document until they didn't need it anymore. But enough were recorded to make it worth your while to check the deed books for them. It just takes a lot of time, particularly if there are no handwritten indexes to the original books, or there are no books of abstracts that genealogists have published and indexed that include all the records. Some of the older books of abstracts of deeds don't include bills of sale because of the prejudice of the white folk who created them, or maybe their embarrassment. In that case, you'd have to look at every page in every deed book to find these gems, but it would be worth it in my opinion. Clerks of court of various counties are beginning to recognize the importance of bills of sale. Guilford County in particular, Jeff Thigpen, Guilford County Register of Deeds, is building a database of all the bills of sale in his records for use on the internet. And the People Not Property Project at UNC Greensboro, as part of the Digital Library on American Slavery, is expanding to index other counties with volunteer help. And you can volunteer too. So I added all this information from the deeds and the wills, the estate records, the guardian papers, the administration papers, to my spreadsheet organized by the name of individual Hinton slaves and Miller slaves. Guess what? No mention of Willis and no mention of Albert. But something told me that the answer must be on the Miller side of the family. I had 2 siblings named Miller after all, Martha and Albert, and just one named Hinton. That's Willis. I'd already looked at the estates of Henry Massey Miller and Isabella W. Hinton Miller, Jane Constance's parents. Both inventories listed all their enslaved people. Then there were yearly accounts when the children were minors, and finally a division of the enslaved people among the heirs, which you see here. It took place around 1850, the year before Jane Constance Hinton was married to Lawrence Hinton. Again, the names aren't familiar. That's when I decided to go back to look again for the marriage and death certificate of Willis Hinton. I could not do the same for Albert Miller. His death certificate didn't list his parents' first names, and his marriage record was a cohabitation record. It did not identify his parents. But I did have success finding Willis's record. And here they are. The death certificate information was given by Miss Ida, the oldest daughter of Willis Hinton. It's really hard to read the names of Willis's parents, but they are here given as Jack Miller and Phyllis Miller. Now, if you go all the way back to Christmas Day, 1869, and the marriage of Willis to Fanny, you can find the marriage record entry in the Register of Marriages, which also gives the parents of each person. Here, Willis's parents are provided as Jacob Hinton and Ruth Hinton. So there seems to be a discrepancy, and which will we take to be correct? Well, Jack and Jacob, they're probably the same name. No problem there. But was it Ruth or was it Phyllis? Which is more reliable? Well, usually the marriage license is preferred, but then we don't know who applied for it. It may not have been Willis himself. I suddenly remembered that I had seen the name Jacob before. It was in the Reminiscence of the Key Basket, written by Jane Constance Miller Hinton. And here is the passage. Fortunately, among the Negroes on the place, there was a good shoemaker, Jacob, and thus the white and black family were provided with shoes made from our leather. And that done, Jacob was sent round to make shoes for the families of relatives and friends. Now that was written during the Civil War, when high-quality shoes were hard to come by. They could not be imported from the North. In the old days, the Hinton and Miller families did not want for fashionable shoes purchased in Raleigh. In fact, the accounts showed that they wanted for nothing. They lived, unusually for the time, on a level that we would associate with romantic novelizations of the Old South. So, Jacob did live on the Lawrence Hinton plantation at the time of the Civil War, and he was a valued craftsman. But he was probably a latecomer because he wasn't in any earlier records of the Miller family who'd settled in Raleigh. Another thing to notice is that between the marriage and the death certificate, the surnames Miller and Hinton were interchanged freely. I suspect Jacob's family started out as Millers and then became Hintons due to a transfer of ownership. And now, because of the estate and guardianship records, we know that that must have happened sometime after 1850, when Albert and Willis were already around the age of 10 or more. So what event could have brought them into the Lawrence Hinton family? I then decided to look more deeply into the Miller genealogy, which you see depicted here. Jane Constance Hinton's father, Henry Massey Miller, and his brother Thomas Miller both came to Granville County, North Carolina from Virginia shortly before 1830. They purchased land and enslaved people there. Some of those records were put into the deed books as bills of sale. Henry Miller married his wife Isabella Hinton in Granville, actually, and he then moved to Raleigh, but Thomas Miller Jr. remained in Granville. It had one of the heaviest concentrations of enslaved people in the state of North Carolina at that time. Now, these brothers had both come from Goochland County, Virginia, just west of Richmond, where their parents were very prominent people. Their ancestors had been members of the Houses of Burgesses, they'd been justices of the courts, and sheriffs of Goochland County. Their father, Thomas Miller Sr., owned 5 plantations in 3 different counties in Virginia. When he died in 1818, over 100 slaves were listed by name in his inventory. The personal papers of Thomas Miller Sr. are now at the Library of Virginia. I have not seen them, but I do have a list of the enslaved. The name Massey came from their mother's side of the family. In fact, the brothers probably decided to go to Granville County because they already had Massey kin there. Their mother's sister had married James Robards, and the Robards had already come to Granville in the 1770s or 1780s. In fact, Thomas Miller Jr. married Mary Ann Robards. His first cousin was removed in 1832, as this chart shows. Now, Miller had a very large farm, 2,000 acres in Granville, which produced much tobacco. Here are the details from the agricultural census about his plantation. But he was also very interested in railroads. He was president and later on a member of the board of directors of the Raleigh and Gaston Railroad until his death in 1858. This line was intended to bring commercial crops from Granville County to markets and warehouses in Raleigh. Miller's father-in-law, Colonel William Robards of LaGrange Plantation, was also heavily invested in the North Carolina Railroad and had served as the state's treasurer before Charles Hinton did. In fact, Hinton probably served as Robards' understudy. And that's possibly how Henry Massey Miller met and married Charles Hinton's sister, Isabella. You see, Hinton knew the Millers through Colonel Robards, his employer. Thomas Miller and his wife, Mary Ann Miller, by the way, figure prominently in the Lawrence Hinton papers and in the Miller guardianship records. Jane Constance Miller spent a lot of time with her aunt and uncle in their plantation on Granville County after she was orphaned and before she got married. They had no children of their own, but did take in some of their nieces and nephews at different times. Jane Constance would definitely have come to know many of the enslaved people living on her Uncle Thomas's plantation. Her Aunt Mary Ann survived her husband, Thomas Miller. She lived through the Civil War and moved to a lot in the small town of Williamsboro, which is now in Vance County. She lost a great deal of her property and evidently went mad in early 1867. The court had to appoint a guardian for her. Mary Ann died later that year. Her guardian must have felt some relief because he was having a lot of trouble finding money to support her. Her primary assets were worthless bonds the state of North Carolina wasn't honoring anymore. And of course her enslaved people were all free by that time. I don't get the sense that Thomas Miller was the kindest or most sympathetic of slave holders. Here's an escaped slave notice from his plantation and a notice of someone taking up the same slave. Note that this man had lost his arm, which was an obvious identifying mark. This may be evidence of abuse or punishment. It may be that he sustained this loss of limb working with machinery, perhaps on the railroad, since his master and his master's father-in-law, Colonel Robards, were both so heavily involved in building and managing them. I found this article by searching for Thomas Miller's name on newspapers.com. Almost all the old 19th century North Carolina newspapers have been digitized and are searchable there. You can learn a lot very quickly. Escaped slave notices are very helpful. I immediately thought that Thomas Miller might have been the former owner of Jacob Miller and his children, Willis, Albert, and Martha. Thomas Miller died in 1858 without a will. His estate inventory lists among his property 75 slaves, as you see here. None of them are named. Here is the notice of their sale, but the report of the administrator shows that they fetched well over $44,000, which is about $1.3 million in today's money. Jane Constance Miller Hinton and her brothers Willis and William Miller were both heirs. They each received 1/3 of 1/6 part of the estate because they were children of his deceased brother, Henry M. Miller. However, the account of how the money was divided shows that only William R. Miller received his part in cash and slaves. Lawrence Hinton's part was cash only. However, I believe it's very likely that Lawrence attended the sale and purchased part of Jacob Miller's family there. Maybe that was because Jane Constance urged him to do it. Albert Miller may have been purchased by a different heir. In fact, he may have fallen into William R. Miller's share. That's just a theory initially, but then I decided to put it to the test. Could I show where some of Thomas Miller's slaves came from and maybe find some of their names? I found a good many bills of sale which show Thomas selling and buying slaves in Granville County, but most of them must have come to him by different means. I suspected inheritance again, and looked at the will of his father-in-law, Colonel William Robards, the ex-treasurer of North Carolina, who died in the summer of 1842. There are two important clauses, and here they are. In the first, Robards indicates that he and his son-in-law Thomas Miller owned a set of slaves jointly. They had already made a division of them, which apparently was not recorded anywhere, but they had been employed working on the railroad and the James River and Canal Company in Virginia. Is this background with railroads reinforced several times over at this point why Albert and his brother Willis were both later railroad workers? And then there's an early clause under which Horace L. Robards, the colonel's son, is empowered to sell a number of enslaved people, among them little Jacob, Phyllis, and Willis. Now our Willis would have been only a few years old at this time, and these are the names of his parents as identified by Ida Hinton on her father's death certificate. There's also Alec, brother of Willis, so perhaps they had an older son that we knew nothing about before. I feel sure that Thomas Miller eventually ended up with these slaves and that they were later purchased by Thomas Miller's nephew by marriage, Lawrence Hinton, at his estate sale in December of 1858. Unfortunately, I never found that document. There are even a few further tantalizing clues. It would appear that Jacob came with his sons and his daughter Martha to Highpoint after the end of slavery, but he apparently didn't live long enough to appear in the 1870 census. How do we know this? Well, here are the cohabitation records for Albert Miller and Willis's sister Martha, first to Henry Caldwell and then to Daniel Miller, both in Guilford County. So Martha was clearly here. I suspect she may have died or moved away around 1870. Her son Jefferson, as we've seen, ended up with her brother Albert. So far, her son Charles, who called himself a Hinton, has not been found either in 1870 or 1880. And here, best of all, is something from our friend Glenn Chavis, a local historian of the black community. He found a petition from 1869 concerning a freedmen's school here in Highpoint. These are local people, very soon after they were freed, pushing to have access to education. They knew that they needed knowledge to defend the new rights that they'd gained as free men. And the Freedmen's Bureau was there to help educate their children and provide a hand up from the degradation slavery had imposed. See the signatures here of both Willis Hinton and Jacob Hinton? That must be Willis's father. I think this is amazing, that in spite of all the division in their family caused by the injustice of slavery, they managed to survive and reunite in Highpoint. But there's also a Jefferson Miller, who couldn't be 3-year-old Jeff Miller, Willis's nephew, in this list. I found that he and another man named Washington Miller eventually settled in Guilford County, just northeast of here, but they seem to have been in Highpoint in 1869. They came with their father, George Miller, who appears in the 1870 census of Guilford County. Now, he was born in 1810, but remember, age can only be a fuzzy estimate for former enslaved people, and he may well have been older than that. Even at that time, he was old enough to be the uncle of Willis Hinton. In fact, the slave named Little George was mentioned in Colonel William Robards' will, and the names Washington and Jeff also appear, though they would have been extremely young at that time. Colonel Robards' father, James Robards, who died in 1804, had enslaved people named Old George with a wife named Dolly, and Little George with a wife named Patty. I suspect this is the lineage from which Albert Miller and Willis Hinton sprang, and you can see that speculation reflected in the final chart, which I will show you. So what you see before you is probably the most precious genealogical information that I gathered for this project, in which I was finally able to show relationships from Willis to his siblings, his nieces and nephews, his parents, and possibly to an uncle, first cousins, and a grandfather. And I'll pause a moment and let you consider this image, all the details that we were able to glean from so many different types of records. So where to go next? If I were going to pursue this lineage further, there are several different steps that I would take. First, I'd try to investigate the records of the North Carolina railroads I've mentioned, the Raleigh and the Gaston and the North Carolina Central, to see if there are registers of enslaved people leased, when, and from whom. Secondly, I think I'd thoroughly study the Robards family and all their bills of sale and inheritance pathways. Third, I'd see if records of slave traders operating in that area do exist and examine them. Fourthly, I'd trace the Robards' descendants and try to find out whether family papers survive anywhere. Next, I'd examine the Thomas Miller papers at the Library of Virginia thoroughly to make sure I hadn't missed a potential Miller pathway of descent. Then I'd investigate the holdings of the New York Public Library, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, for any help with what happened to Albert and Martha and their descendants in New York. I'd trace the descendants of the Hinton and Miller family and compare notes on family traditions, and I'd explore the genetic testing possibilities for descendants of anyone living on these plantations. Of course, eventually you'll hit a dead end, and maybe we already have, but there are definitely steps that can still be taken. I want to end with a really startling picture which is connected to this entire story. This is a photo of the plantation called the Oaks in Wake County. It belonged to the maternal grandfather of Jane Constance Hinton, Captain David Hinton, prior to the Civil War. The image you see is not from the period of slavery at all. It was taken in the 1890s when this plantation became the Wake County Prison Farm. The men and women you see in striped garments are state prisoners who were assigned to work on this farm as punishment for crimes or to pay off court fees, costs, or debt. And you see their white guards and overseers bearing weapons. This is the unknown and neglected story about slavery, that it didn't really end in 1865 for many people. A lot of prisoners were detained on minor or trumped-up charges like vagrancy or fornication, on debts that they didn't know they owed, and summarily sent to places like this with very little due process. Many were leased out to private farms, factories, mines, and lumber camps, or set to work on constructing roads and railways. Many were grievously abused, many died. I told you that the 1890s were a time when whites were reasserting their power, imposing Jim Crow, taking away black people's voting rights. This is one way they did that. This is what Willis Hinton and his family escaped. It was part of a largely unknown story until recently highlighted in this book called Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman. I hope that you'll read it and be inspired to dig into North Carolina records to see how it operated here and who disappeared into this heartless system of oppression.